Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Caldor village carried with it whispers of lives, laughter, and sorrow, but inside the small compound where Dira lived, joy was something that had long packed its bags and departed. The house itself was old, the walls built from red clay, its cracked surface revealing years of rain and sunshine, but to Dira, those walls were more than cracks and stains. They were prisons without iron bars. She was born into that house when her mother was still alive, and in those days the walls echoed with lullabies, with the sweet hum of her mother's voice as she rocked her to sleep, with pots simmering on the fire, and her father's footsteps returning at dusk. It was a home then, soft as morning dew. But when the fever came like a thief in the night and stole her mother away, that same house began to close in on her like a tightening fist. Her father, broken like a calabash shattered on stone, remarried far too soon, not out of wickedness but out of fear of loneliness, and that was when Marjorie entered their lives. At first, Dira, young and still struggling to understand the weight of her mother's absence, looked at Marjorie with the timid hope that a child clings to when seeking comfort. She thought perhaps the woman would pick up where her mother had stopped, perhaps her lap would be as warm, her embrace as soft. But that was a dream that died before it could even stretch its legs. Marjorie smiled only when others were watching, and her smile was like an axe covered in honey, sweet on the surface but deadly at its core. As days turned into weeks, her words sharpened into daggers, and the tone of her voice wrapped Dira's childhood in thorns. Each chore became a punishment, each mistake a crime, and each meal a privilege rather than a right. A girl who once knew the smell of her mother's soups now learned the emptiness of going to bed with a belly that growled like a restless drum. The house grew colder, not in temperature but in spirit, a place where laughter was exiled, and tears found permanent residence in the shadows. Dira's father tried, in the beginning, to keep balance in the home. He was not blind to the way Marjorie treated the child, though he often explained it away with excuses, telling himself that perhaps it was adjustment, perhaps with time the edges would soften. He would pat Dira's head, whisper encouragement, and promise to take her to the stream when the weekend came, but illness was already tying its invisible ropes around him. His cough began like the whisper of dry leaves but soon roared like thunder, and with every passing moon, he became a shadow of himself. The day he died, Dira stood at the corner of the room, her hands clutched together, eyes wide, as the last thread of protection snapped. Death left her alone with Marjorie, and from that moment, the walls of the house seemed to tilt inward, leaning closer, suffocating her. Marjorie no longer had reason to wear her mask, and her cruelty poured out freely. The chores multiplied, the insults deepened, and the little scraps of love that Dira hoped for disappeared like smoke blown by harmattan winds. At night, she would lie on her mat, watching the faint glow of the lantern against the ceiling, and whisper to a god she barely understood, "See me. If anyone does see me." In her small world, faith became the only thread she held, thin as it was, for everything else had been stripped away. The other children of Caldor laughed and played, running with bare feet across the dusty streets, but Dira was always missing from their games. Her time was stolen by sweeping, washing, fetching water, grinding pepper, and running errands that kept her body in motion, but her spirit heavy. She learned early that not all wounds bleed. Some cut the soul in silence. When people in the village passed their compound, they sometimes caught sight of her thin frame darting from one task to another. A few whispered among themselves, "That girl looks more like a servant than a daughter." But no one interfered. In Caldor, matters of the home were considered private, and tongues were careful not to stir what hands would not help. They shook their heads in pity, but pity did not fill empty bowls. Dira grew used to silence, both her own and that of others. She learned to make her face a mask, swallowing her emotions until her eyes no longer betrayed her heart. Inside, though, her memories of her mother's tenderness still flickered like a candle struggling against the wind. She remembered how her mother's hands felt, soft and smelling of shea butter, as they braided her hair, and how her voice carried warmth that made even nightfall less frightening. These memories became Dira's secret refuge, a place she visited whenever Marjorie's words became too sharp. But even memories can sting when reality is cruel. Marjorie began to call her names that pressed like stones on her chest. Worthless, cursed, unwanted. Those words became echoes in her mind, chasing her even in dreams. Each morning, she woke up with resolve to survive the day, to endure whatever came, and to whisper once again into the quiet air, "God see me." If hope were water, hers was a cracked pot, but even in cracks some drops remain. The cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was in the way Marjorie handed her food, scraps tossed into a broken plate as though feeding a stray dog. Sometimes it was in the way her eyes looked through her, cold and dismissive, as if she were a shadow instead of a child. Dira learned that pain did not need shouting to cut deep. Silence could be its own weapon. She often wandered to the backyard where a mango tree stood, its branches stretched like arms toward the sky, and she would sit beneath it, hugging her knees. That tree became her confidant. She spoke to it in whispers, telling it her fears, her memories, her prayers. And though it never answered, its stillness comforted her. The leaves rustled when the wind blew, and to Dira it felt like a nod, like a promise that someone, or something, was listening. Life under Marjorie was a slow erosion, like river water carving stone, invisible at first but devastating over time. The laughter of childhood had been stolen, and in its place, she carried silence heavy enough to break a grown heart. But in the depths of her suffering, a seed was being buried, one that pain could not kill, a seed that one day would rise in defiance of all she endured. For now, though she was only a girl, small and fragile, holding on to whispers of hope as though her very life depended on them, for indeed it did. Dira's world, after her father's passing, became like a house where the laughter had been swept away with the dust, leaving behind walls that carried echoes of footsteps and the creak of doors, but no song. Marjorie filled the silence with her own rhythm, her bangles chiming as she moved from corner to corner like a restless broom sweeping at shadows. She had a way of watching the child as though measuring her usefulness rather than her heart. The chores began to multiply the way weeds spread when rain overstays its welcome. Morning was no longer an invitation to stretch and greet the day, but a command barked by Marjorie's voice, sharp as the snap of dry wood. "Up before the cocks," she would say, shaking the mat with a force that rattled the bones of sleep. Dira's small hands grew familiar with water, so cold it bit the skin as she fetched it from the distant well at dawn. The bucket was heavy, but Marjorie never accepted complaints. Instead, she reminded her that a child who cannot carry water cannot carry destiny. The child scrubbed floors until her palms smarted, pounded yam until her wrists sang, and bent over steaming pots until her hair smelled more of smoke than of innocence. At night she would lie on her mat staring at the rafters, tracing the spider webs like constellations, whispering to the darkness that pressed against her, "Mama, if you can see me, ask God to notice." Her words were not answers, but seeds thrown at a sky too wide to reply. Neighbors who passed through the compound sometimes caught sight of her frail frame, carrying wood too large for her body, but they turned their faces away with proverbs ready on their tongues. "Another man's soup is best left untasted," they said to themselves, unwilling to stir quarrels that were not theirs. And so the girl learned the bitter lesson that a village may watch your tears and still let them dry on your cheeks. Each day folded into the next like pages of a book being written by someone else's hand, and in that book she played the role of servant rather than child, a shadow moving through her father's house as though she had no claim to it. If the days were hard, the evenings were heavier, weighted with the peculiar stillness that settles when grief collides with authority. After the chores, after the pots gleamed and the floor bore no trace of dust, Marjorie would summon Dira to sit before her, not for affection but for instructions disguised as lessons. "You must know," she said one evening, tightening the wrapper around her waist, "that the world does not pity the lazy. Your mother spoiled you with softness, but I will carve strength into your bones." Her words fell like stones into water, rippling out and sinking fast. Dira listened, her gaze fixed on the lantern's flame that trembled each time the night breeze touched it, wishing she could vanish into its flicker. Marjorie spoke of her own childhood, of trading oranges under the unforgiving Enugu sun, of carrying siblings on her back while her stomach remained empty. Each story ended with a warning. "No one carried me, and no one will carry you." When visitors came, Marjorie draped her words with honey, praising discipline and how she was raising the child to be useful and God-fearing. They nodded approvingly, sipping palm wine, admiring her composure, and never guessing the wit beneath her smile. To the outside world, she was the portrait of order. To Dira, she was the gate that kept freedom locked away. As darkness deepened and the crickets tuned their steady orchestra, Dira's heart tightened inside her chest, because she knew that even sleep would not bring escape. Dreams often replayed her mother's voice calling her name, only for the sound to melt into Marjorie's commands. She would wake with tears drying on her cheeks, quietly folding the pain back into herself like a secret letter no one must read. It was in those long nights she learned that silence is not merely the absence of words, but the weight of all the words you wish you could speak and dare not. The pattern of her life grew so predictable that each sunrise felt like a repetition of the last, but within that monotony, a kind of invisible bruising began to gather. Hunger became her constant companion, not only for food but for affection, for even a glance that held warmth. Meals were measured like rations in a soldier's camp. While Marjorie's plate steamed with generous servings, Dira was often given scraps, bones picked clean or yam peels boiled with salt. Her stomach learned to settle for less, but her spirit did not. She clung to memories the way a drowning hand clutches driftwood, her father's voice pointing out the moon, her mother's soft laugh when she braided her hair, the weight of love she once thought permanent. At times, the child tried to create her own comfort. She kept a broken doll her father had carved from wood, its head chipped but its arms intact. At night she whispered to it, imagining it listened better than people ever did. Once, when Marjorie caught her murmuring to the doll, she snatched it away and tossed it into the fire. "You need no useless toys," she barked. "Learn to talk to work instead." The flames devoured the doll, and something inside Dira crackled alongside it. She bit her lips until they bled, refusing to cry aloud, because she had learned that tears were interpreted as weakness, and weakness earned only more scorn. Life in Caldor carried on around her. Children played in the fields, traders haggled noisily at the market, bells rang from churches. But for her, each sound became a reminder of the distance between her and a world that seemed to belong to everyone else. She lived inside the same city, under the same skies, but her days were a room without windows, a cage cleverly disguised as a home. Still, a small ember of hope hid within her, stubborn and glowing, because in her quiet heart she believed that the God she prayed to in whispers must have heard at least one word, and perhaps one day would send an answer, though she had no clue how or when it might arrive. The breaking point came one late afternoon when the sun leaned heavily on the roofs of Enugu, pouring its last gold over the land. Dira had spent the day running between tasks, fetching water twice, grinding pepper until her fingers burned, and scrubbing clothes until her knuckles turned raw. She moved slowly, drained by fatigue, and in her weariness she spilled a calabash of water across the clay floor. It was a small mistake, the kind any tired child might make, but Marjorie's eyes sharpened like machetes at the sight. "Are you blind as well as useless?" she shouted, her voice carrying across the compound, drawing curious glances from neighbors who once again pretended not to notice. She slapped the girl hard enough that the sting spread fire across her cheek, and as Dira staggered, Marjorie's words cut deeper than the blow. "You are cursed, just like your mother. Nothing good will ever grow from you." The insult clung to her skin like wet cloth, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to scream that her mother had been kind, gentle, the very opposite of a curse, but her tongue remained prisoner behind her teeth. That night, as she lay on her mat nursing the ache in her cheek, the stars seemed farther away than ever, like shy witnesses refusing to testify. She whispered again to the silence, her voice trembling, "God, if you are there, please do not forget me." Outside, the wind moved through the mango trees with a sigh, carrying her words into the dark. And though no answer came, something inside her shifted, the quiet awareness that pain could not be endless, that rivers which run through valleys must one day reach the sea. She closed her eyes with that fragile thought cradled in her heart, unaware that the days ahead would soon test whether hope could survive when the world insists you were never meant to rise. The evening sky over Enugu bled red that day, the kind of twilight that makes every shadow look longer than it should, as if the world itself was stretching towards something it couldn't quite touch. Dira had been bent over for hours, pounding cassava with a pestle taller than her arm, sweat streaking her face and staining her threadbare blouse. The work seemed endless, yet she pressed on, knowing that if she slowed, Marjorie's voice would come down like thunder on a thirsty hill. When she finally lifted the basin to carry it inside, her legs wobbled, and some of the cassava spilled onto the ground. The mistake, small as it was, snapped the brittle thread of Marjorie's patience. She stormed into the yard, her wrapper flaring behind her like the wings of an angry bird, and seized the basin from Dira's hands. "Are you determined to ruin everything you touch?" she shrieked, striking the girl across the back with the flat of her palm. The blow stung, but worse than the pain was the humiliation of hearing neighbors shuffle by the gate, their silence louder than any protest could have been. Dira pressed her lips together, holding back tears that begged to fall, because she knew that in this house, tears were a kind of fuel for more cruelty. "You are a disgrace," Marjorie spat, her words cutting through the humid air. "You walk around like someone waiting for pity, but let me tell you, there is no pity in this world for a child cursed at birth." Dira wanted to vanish into the dust beneath her feet, but the dust only clung to her toes as though mocking her helplessness. Night crept in slowly, the crickets starting their mournful chorus, and Dira dragged her weary body to the corner where she slept, clutching her thin wrapper as if it were armor. Her body ached, her stomach growled, and her spirit whispered only one line into the emptiness: "This cannot be all there is for me." She fell asleep that night knowing something within her was bending close to breaking, a small thread of endurance stretched to its limit, and the world around her did not care whether it snapped or held. The next morning, the harmattan air carried a sharp bite, a cold that slid into the bones and lingered. Dira rose early as always, fetching water before the cock crowed, her breath making small ghosts in the pale light. She carried the heavy bucket on her head, each step sinking slightly into the dusty path that led from the well back to the compound. Children her age laughed somewhere in the distance, their voices skipping like stones across water, but their joy only deepened the hollow echo in her chest. When she returned, Marjorie was waiting at the doorway, arms folded, eyes narrow. "Late," she declared, though dawn had barely cracked. She pointed to a pile of clothes waiting to be scrubbed, and then to a stack of firewood needing to be split. Dira swallowed hard, her throat dry, and moved wordlessly to obey. Hours later, as she bent over the washing stone, her hands raw and her knuckles white, a sudden dizziness swept over her. The world tilted, and she nearly collapsed, but she steadied herself, unwilling to give Marjorie the satisfaction of seeing weakness. "Do not dawdle," came the sharp command from across the yard. "If you cannot finish this by sunset, you will go to bed hungry." Hunger was no stranger. It had become a constant shadow trailing her, a hollow drum that beat inside her ribs. Still, she pushed on, scrubbing until the fabric blurred before her eyes. By the time the sun lowered itself behind the Enugu hills, her body throbbed with exhaustion. She placed the washed clothes neatly on the line, hoping for a word, any word, of acknowledgement. None came. Instead, Marjorie sniffed and muttered, barely acceptable, before disappearing inside. That night, Dira's hunger gnawed more fiercely than ever, but it was not the hunger for food that made her eyes wet. It was the hunger for kindness, for the simple recognition that she existed not as a burden, but as a child deserving of love. She curled up under her thin wrapper, whispering to herself the lullabies her mother used to hum, her voice breaking on every other note, until exhaustion finally closed her eyes. The moon shone coldly through the window, silvering the rough floor, as if bearing silent witness to a child whose world had become too sharp for her small hands to hold. Weeks blurred together like ink spilled across a page, and in that blur, Dira's spirit began to shrink into corners where Marjorie's shadow could not reach. Yet shadows always grow, and hers seemed to stretch with every passing day. One evening, while preparing stew, Dira accidentally dropped a piece of meat onto the floor. The meat rolled under the stool, and before she could retrieve it, Marjorie entered. Her eyes lit with fury, and without hesitation, she struck the child with the wooden spoon in her hand. The sharp crack echoed in the small room, and Dira bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. "Food does not fall unless cursed hands touch it," Marjorie shouted, glaring at her with a venom that seemed older than the moment itself. Dira crouched, reaching for the fallen piece, but her stepmother kicked it away, muttering, "Let the dogs eat what belongs to dogs." The words cut more deeply than the blow, branding themselves on the girl's tender heart. Later that night, as the stew bubbled and the household ate, Dira sat in the corner with only a bowl of watery broth. She sipped it slowly, not for the taste, there was none, but to stretch the little she had. As she swallowed, her mind wandered to memories of her mother, the taste of warm bread and honeyed tea, the way gentle hands once wiped crumbs from her cheeks. The contrast was almost unbearable, and tears slipped down despite her best efforts. She turned her face away, hoping Marjorie wouldn't notice, but the woman always noticed. "You waste water from your eyes as if it is endless," she snapped. "Do you think crying will bring back what is gone? Crying never feeds the hungry or washes dirty plates." The cruelty was relentless, and the words sank into Dira's bones, yet beneath the weight of despair, a tiny spark began to flicker. She realized that her tears, though scorned, were proof she still felt, proof she had not become stone. That spark, small as it was, whispered to her that surviving each day was itself a form of defiance, a way of saying, I am still here. She clung to that thought, repeating it silently as the night deepened and the wind whispered through the mango trees outside the compound. The breaking came on a night when the stars burned brighter than usual, scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. The air was crisp, filled with the distant sounds of drums from a nearby celebration, though joy never seemed to cross the threshold of their compound. Dira had been given the task of washing a stack of plates late into the night, her body swaying from exhaustion, her eyelids heavy as stones. In her weariness, she accidentally cracked one of the plates, the sharp sound slicing through the stillness. Marjorie stormed into the yard, her face twisted with rage, and before Dira could explain, the woman seized her by the arm and dragged her toward the gate. Enough! She bellowed, her voice echoing across the compound. You are nothing but bad luck, nothing but a curse walking on two legs. This house has no space for you. Dira's heart pounded as the gate creaked open, the cold night air rushing to meet her. Marjorie shoved her out with such force that she stumbled onto the dusty road. The final words burned like fire. Call your God to save you now, since you believe he listens. Let him give you food and shelter if he can. The gate slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through her chest like a final verdict. Alone in the dark, barefoot and trembling, Dira stared at the empty road stretching before her, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. Fear coiled inside her, but beneath it, something else stirred, a fragile thread of hope that perhaps the world beyond the gate held more than pain. She walked slowly, each step heavy, her small shadow stretching across the dirt like a companion unwilling to leave her. The night was alive with distant sounds, dogs barking, owls calling, the whisper of trees swaying in the breeze. But to her, it felt like the whole universe was holding its breath. With each step, she whispered into the dark, not as a plea but as a declaration. I will not disappear. And though her body trembled and her stomach cried with hunger, she pressed forward into the unknown, unaware that destiny had already set its eyes on her, waiting just beyond the bend in the road. The road that night was longer than any she had ever known, though her small legs had wandered through Enugu's outskirts many times before. With each step, the dust rose and clung to her toes, turning her feet the color of clay. The moon peered down, half hidden by drifting clouds, as if uncertain whether to watch or to hide its face from her misery. Dira moved like a drifting leaf torn from its branch, her thin frame trembling in the chilly breeze. Each time the wind rustled through the trees, she flinched, fearing it was Marjorie's voice chasing after her, ready to hurl another insult. But only silence followed her, except for the nocturnal calls of owls and the occasional bark of a faraway dog. Hunger gnawed at her stomach with claws sharper than any whip she had endured. She had not eaten since morning, and her lips were dry and cracked. Her throat begged for water, but all she carried was her tattered wrapper tied loosely around her waist. She paused at a bend in the road, glancing back at the direction of the compound, but the gate was far behind her now, swallowed by darkness. A sob welled up in her chest, but she swallowed it down, remembering how her tears had always been used as proof of weakness. Instead, she whispered into the night, Mama, if you see me, don't let me die here. The stars twinkled faintly, silent but present, as if holding secrets she could not yet understand. Step by step, she pressed on until her legs wavered beneath her, and finally, she collapsed near a cluster of bushes by the roadside. The ground was hard, scattered with stones, but exhaustion overcame the discomfort. Her body curled into itself, her arms cradling her stomach as though to silence its cries. In that lonely darkness, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, where dreams carried fragments of her mother's voice, only to break apart into echoes of Marjorie's curses. Yet even as she slept, a quiet thread of destiny stretched invisibly across the road, leading toward the moment that would alter her life in ways she could never have imagined. Morning arrived slowly, the first light creeping across the sky like hesitant fingers brushing open a curtain. Birds began their songs, cheerful in their ignorance of the girl who lay curled on the roadside, her hair tangled, her clothes streaked with dust. It was the sound of approaching footsteps that stirred her awake. She blinked against the brightness and saw the figure of a man standing nearby, his shadow stretching long across the ground. He was middle-aged, with tired but kind eyes, his shoulders carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much of the world, but had not let it harden him completely. He carried a satchel slung across his body, filled with books that peeked out like restless companions. His name was Mr. Alcott, a teacher from Rentsfield town, and though Dira did not know him, something about the calmness in his gaze eased her trembling. He knelt beside her and asked in a voice neither harsh nor pitying, "Child, what are you doing here?" For a moment she could not answer. Her throat was too dry, her fear too heavy. Finally she whispered, "I have nowhere to go." The simplicity of the statement carried the weight of her entire life, and it sank into the man's heart like a stone dropped into still water. He studied her closely, the bruises that lingered like shadows on her skin, the thinness of her arms, the hollow in her cheeks that spoke of many nights spent hungry. Without hesitation, he reached into his satchel and produced a small loaf of bread and a flask of water. He handed them to her gently, as one might hand treasure to someone who has forgotten what it feels like to hold anything of value. Dira stared for a moment, hesitant, as though expecting the food to vanish, then seized it and ate with urgency, crumbs spilling down her chin. Mr. Alcott watched silently, allowing her dignity, and when she finished he said softly, "Come with me. You cannot stay on this road." The words felt like an open door, fragile and unbelievable, but something inside her stirred, a cautious flame refusing to be snuffed out. She rose slowly, her body weak, but her heart beating with a rhythm she had not felt in years, something close to hope. The path to Rentsfield was not long, but to Dira, it felt like a crossing from one world into another. She walked beside Mr. Alcott, her bare feet pressing into the earth, while he carried his satchel with the steady stride of a man used to long journeys. Along the way, he spoke little, perhaps sensing that silence was its own kind of kindness. Occasionally, he pointed out a bird or a passing cart, his tone gentle, as though reminding her that the world contained more than sorrow. When they arrived at his modest home, tucked near the edge of town, his wife emerged to greet them. Mrs. Alcott was a plump woman with warm eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She looked at Dira first with surprise, then with a tenderness that Dira was not used to receiving. "Who is this child?" she asked. Mr. Alcott explained briefly, sparing the details that would only deepen the ache. "She needs a place to rest," he said simply. Without hesitation, Mrs. Alcott ushered the girl inside, offering her a seat and another meal. The warmth of the food, the unfamiliar softness of kindness, and the quiet hum of a household not ruled by cruelty wrapped around Dira like a blanket. For the first time in so long, she ate without fear of reproach, her body trembling with the strange sensation of being safe, even if only for a moment. That night, when she lay down on a small mat they provided, she stared at the wooden ceiling beams and felt something shift within her. She was not just surviving another day, she was standing at the edge of a new beginning. The quiet voice that had whispered in her darkest nights, "God, see me," seemed to answer faintly, not in thunder or miracles, but in the simple kindness of strangers who saw her not as a burden, but as a child worth saving. Sleep came easily that night, and for once, it was not filled with nightmares but with a cautious dream of tomorrow. Days melted into weeks, and in that home, Dira began to blossom in ways she had never believed possible. Mr. Alcott noticed her sharp mind and restless curiosity, the way her eyes lit up when she glimpsed the books in his satchel, as though they were treasures locked behind a glass she longed to break. One evening, after she shyly confessed her desire to learn, he placed a worn primer into her hands. "Start here," he said, guiding her through letters and simple words. Her fingers trembled as she traced the shapes, her lips stumbling over sounds, but her determination burned bright. Night after night, by the glow of a lantern, she practiced, her voice soft but steady, whispering the alphabet like prayers. Mrs. Alcott encouraged her, correcting gently, praising each small victory. Soon she was able to read simple sentences, then more, her hunger for knowledge as fierce as her hunger once was for food. Mr. Alcott saw this and made a decision. He would send her to school. The announcement left her speechless, tears pooling in her eyes, not from sorrow but from a joy so unfamiliar it frightened her. She began attending classes, her second-hand uniform hanging loosely on her thin frame, her bare feet sometimes mocked by classmates, but none of it mattered. She absorbed knowledge like dry earth drinks the rain, refusing to waste a drop. Teachers marveled at her diligence, at the way she stayed behind to ask questions, scribbling notes until her fingers cramped. At home, she studied late into the night, determined to catch up on all the years she had lost. The child who once whispered her worth into the dark now carried within her a growing certainty. She was not cursed, she was not useless, she was not the shadow her stepmother painted her to be. The ember inside her had found kindling, and though the road ahead was long and uncertain, for the first time in her life, she felt the stirrings of a fire that no cruelty could extinguish. The years that followed were like water carving its way through stone, slow but relentless, reshaping Dira in ways no one, not even she could have foreseen. At first, school was a struggle, her tongue stumbling over big words and her hand cramping as it learned to chase letters across a page. But determination became her companion, a stubborn flame she guarded fiercely. Every day she rose before dawn, helping Mrs. Alcott with small chores, then hurried to class with books pressed tightly against her chest. Sometimes the other children laughed at her second-hand shoes, or the way her uniform sagged loosely against her thin frame, but she swallowed the sting of mockery and turned it into fuel. She sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the blackboard, as if it were a door to another world she longed to step into. Teachers noticed her eagerness, the way her hand always shot up when a question was asked, the way she stayed behind to copy notes long after others had gone home. Knowledge became not just a path but a refuge. Within numbers and sentences, she found order and promise, something far different from the chaos she had known in her childhood. At home, the Alcotts encouraged her with quiet pride. Mr. Alcott often returned from school with old textbooks, placing them on her lap like treasures. "Read," he would say, and she did greedily, hungrily, turning each page as though it might vanish if she blinked too long. She read under the flickering lantern when the town slept, her lips moving silently, whispering strange new words to herself until they became familiar friends. What began as small steps grew into leaps, her grades climbing steadily, her confidence growing roots deep inside her. For the first time in her life, she began to imagine a future that was hers to shape, a life not defined by cruelty but by possibility. The girl who once crouched in shadows was learning to stand in light, though the memory of darkness never truly left her. Instead, it became the wind behind her, pushing her forward with a fierce insistence. Never go back, never bow to despair again. By the time Dira reached her teenage years, the world around her had begun to change, and so had she. The streets of Enugu bustled with new rhythms, hawkers calling out their wares, buses honking as they fought for space, radios crackling with songs that filled the air with promise of modern times. Dira moved through it all with a quiet determination, her steps carrying her toward a dream she hadn't even dared to name yet. In the classrooms, she shone brighter with every term, her teachers often pausing to marvel at the depth of her answers, the sharpness of her reasoning. Mathematics, which many of her peers feared, became her playground. Science, with its endless puzzles, became her chosen language. She was fascinated by the mysteries of the human body, the delicate machinery hidden beneath skin and bone. She remembered too clearly how her father had coughed himself into the grave, how helpless she had felt, and how her prayers then had seemed too small against death's enormity. That memory hardened into resolve. "If I can learn enough," she whispered to herself one night, "I will not watch someone I love vanish without a fight." The Alcotts supported her every step of the way, even when it strained their modest means. They saved coins, tightened their belts, and celebrated each of her report cards as though they were victories for the whole household. When neighbors whispered admiration, Mrs. Alcott would beam with pride and say, "This girl carries a fire in her that no one can quench." Yet beneath the pride, Dira carried a shadow, the echo of Marjorie's voice, reminding her of curses and worthlessness. The echo did not silence her, but it never left either. It was like a scar under her skin, invisible to others but always felt by her. She drove herself harder, studied longer, chased perfection with the desperation of someone who feared one misstep might confirm all those old cruel words. In her private moments, she would press her palms together and murmur, "See me now, Mama. I will make you proud." Each time, the wind outside seemed to stir as if carrying her vow into the night. When she finally sat for the exams that determined entry into higher learning, Dira's hands shook as she held her pen, not from fear of failure, but from the weight of what success would mean. Each question on the page felt like a door she had to push open, each answer like a step toward the life she dreamed of. She worked carefully, recalling the long nights under the lantern, the endless repetition of formulas, the countless notes scribbled until her fingers cramped. When the results were announced weeks later, she stood in the crowd, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. Her name appeared among the highest scores, her acceptance into medical school secured. For a moment, the world blurred as tears filled her eyes, not tears of sorrow this time, but of triumph so sharp it hurt. She ran home, her uniform fluttering behind her like a flag, and burst into the Alcott's small sitting room, the letter clutched tightly in her hands. Mrs. Alcott wept openly, hugging her as though afraid to let go, while Mr. Alcott stood silently, his eyes glistening, his pride too large for words. That evening they prepared a small feast, just rice with stew and a bit of meat, but it felt like a banquet fit for royalty. Dira ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing that each grain carried the taste of sacrifice and love. That night, as she lay on her mat, the acceptance letter folded carefully beside her, she thought about the girl who had once been thrown into the night with nothing but fear and whispered prayers. That girl had not vanished. She had survived, and now she was standing at the threshold of a future she had carved with her own hands. The darkness had not won. Instead, it had given birth to a strength no cruelty could erase. Sleep carried her gently that night, wrapped not in nightmares but in dreams of white coats and stethoscopes, of hospitals where she would one day stand not as a victim of fate, but as a healer shaping it. Medical school was a world both brutal and beautiful, demanding long hours of study, sleepless nights, and a discipline sharper than any blade. Dira stepped into it with the same determination that had carried her this far, her heart set on turning pain into purpose. The lectures were crowded, the competition fierce, but she refused to shrink. She took notes until her hand ached, asked questions others were too timid to ask, and spent late nights in the library with her eyes burning, but her mind unwilling to rest. Cadavers on the dissection tables filled many students with dread, but she approached them with reverence, whispering silent thanks to the bodies that had become her teachers. She knew too well what it meant to lose life, and she promised herself that one day she would fight for it with everything she had learned. Poverty shadowed her steps. There were days she went without proper meals, days she patched her worn shoes with thread to keep them from falling apart, but she carried herself with quiet pride. When others faltered under the weight of failure, she steadied herself with memories of all she had endured already. No exam, no sleepless night, no struggle could rival the years she had survived in Marjorie's house. That thought gave her strength, a silent mantra she repeated whenever exhaustion threatened to drown her. Slowly, steadily, she rose among her peers, her name whispered with respect in lecture halls and hospital corridors. She became known for her diligence, her precision, her compassion with patients even as a student. One evening, as she left the hospital after a long shift, she paused to watch the city lights of Enugu twinkling like stars brought down to earth. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a smile without hesitation. The road had been long, filled with shadows, but here she was, walking it still, stronger than the girl who once whispered prayers into the night. Her destiny was no longer a question whispered into silence. It was an answer unfolding, step by step, with each heartbeat reminding her that she had survived not by chance, but by the fire that refused to die inside her. The rain had been steady all afternoon, tapping against the hospital windows like restless fingers, while the scent of disinfectant mingled with the damp air drifting in through the half-opened louver blades. Dira, now wearing the white coat that once existed only in her fragile dreams, walked briskly through the corridors of the teaching hospital in Enugu, her stethoscope bouncing lightly against her chest. Her steps were sure, but her eyes carried the quiet weight of one who had seen too much suffering to ever move lightly. The day had been long, one emergency after another, one life saved, another lost, and she thought of nothing more than resting when a nurse approached, breathless, and said, "Dr. Dira, there is an urgent admission. The patient is critical. We need you immediately." She nodded, weary but alert, and made her way toward the ward. As she entered, the air felt strangely heavier, and though she could not yet explain why, something inside her heart braced itself. On the stretcher lay a frail woman, her body wasted, skin clinging tightly to bone, hair streaked with gray, eyes closed but fluttering in pain. Nurses moved quickly, checking vitals, murmuring instructions, but all sounds dimmed as Dira stepped closer. The woman's face, though ravaged by illness, carried familiar lines that time could not erase. Recognition struck her like lightning, sharp, blinding, impossible to ignore. The years fell away in an instant, and she was no longer the doctor standing tall in her white coat, but the little girl crouched in a yard, the child who had been told she was cursed, who had been shoved into the night with the words, "Call your God to save you now." It was Marjorie, her stepmother. The gate that had once closed so loudly behind her was suddenly opening again in her memory, and the echoes of that night returned with brutal clarity. For a heartbeat, Dira froze, her breath caught somewhere between past and present. The room around her buzzed with urgency, but inside her, silence thundered. She looked down at the woman who had once looked down on her, and the contrast was so sharp it felt like the world itself had folded in two. The patient stirred, her eyelids fluttering open just long enough for a weak groan to escape. Her voice was barely audible, yet in it lingered the tone Dira knew too well. The same pitch that once barked orders, the same timbre that had hurled insults into her ears until they rang like bells. Now it was cracked and trembling, stripped of authority, wrapped in desperation. "Doctor, please," Marjorie whispered, her lips trembling as though the very act of forming words cost her strength she no longer had. She did not yet recognize who stood before her. Perhaps illness blurred her vision, or perhaps the years had painted too many changes across the girl's once thin face. Dira's fingers tightened on her stethoscope, her pulse quickening. A storm raged inside her, memories of hunger, of slaps, of whispered prayers that no one seemed to hear. And yet, above the storm, another voice rose within her, quieter but stronger. The oath she had taken, the vow to heal, to do no harm, to fight for life no matter whose it was. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in deeply, and when she opened them, she allowed the doctor in her to guide her hands rather than the wounded child. "Prepare in 4, she instructed the nurses, her tone steady. "We need fluids and immediate stabilization." Her voice did not waver, though her heart trembled. As they worked, Dira's mind flashed with images, herself as a child, crouching in the dark outside the gate, herself curled on a roadside with nothing but hunger in her belly and whispered prayers in her throat, herself waking to kindness in the Alcott's home, clutching her first book with trembling hands. And now, here she was, standing tall beside the woman who had once pushed her into the night, holding in her hands the power not of revenge, but of life itself. The irony was sharp, like a blade turned in sunlight. Fate had circled back, not with vengeance, but with a cruel elegance that forced her to decide what kind of woman she had become. Hours later, when the emergency subsided and Marjorie rested under thin hospital sheets, Dira sat by the bedside, her expression unreadable. She studied the woman's face, the lines of hardship etched deep into her skin, the fragility of a body that had once seemed unbreakable. The strong hands that had once shoved her away now trembled weakly on the blanket, veins protruding like rivers drying under the sun. Dira leaned back in her chair, her thoughts churning. She remembered the countless nights she had begged for kindness, the endless days of labor without praise, the sting of words that told her she was cursed. And yet, here was the living answer to her childhood prayers, proof that her God had indeed saved her, not by lifting her out with fire or angels, but by guiding her steps, by placing strangers in her path, by shaping her into the healer she had always longed to be. She realized then that she had been wrong to think she carried only scars from those years. What she carried was also strength, carved into her by hardship, forged in pain, refined in perseverance. Without those years, without even Marjorie's cruelty, she might never have stood here at all. The thought did not excuse the past, but it illuminated the strange way destiny weaves both cruelty and kindness into its fabric, and from them spins something stronger. She reached out and gently adjusted the 4-line, her touch professional but soft. Marjorie stirred faintly, her eyes flickering open, and for the first time they locked with Dira's. Recognition dawned slowly, creeping into her expression with disbelief and horror. Her lips parted, forming the beginning of a word, perhaps a name, but no sound came. Dira did not flinch. She met the gaze steadily, her own eyes calm, almost tender, as though she had nothing left to prove. The silence between them stretched long, filled with all the unsaid words of years gone by. Marjorie's gaze pleaded, guilt swimming in the hollows of her eyes, but Dira remained quiet. She rose, smoothing the front of her coat, and leaned close enough that her words would reach only Marjorie's ears. "You told me to call my God," she whispered, her tone low but unwavering. He answered, "Not as you expected, but in ways you could never imagine." She straightened, her expression unreadable, and turned toward the door. Behind her, the nurses bustled, adjusting charts, checking vitals, unaware of the storm that had just passed between the two women. As Dira walked down the corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly, steady and sure, like a drumbeat announcing not vengeance, but victory. She carried no anger in her stride, only the quiet certainty of one who has risen above pain. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the clouds parting to reveal a sky where the first stars began to flicker awake. Dira lifted her face to the cool air, breathing deeply, and for the first time in years, she felt the fullness of her journey settle inside her. She was no longer the abandoned child, no longer the frightened girl whispering to the night. She was the answer to her own prayers, living proof that even in the darkest nights, a seed of hope can take root and bloom. And as she walked away, the city of Enugu hummed with its ordinary life, children laughing in the distance, buses rattling along the road, the world carrying on, while within her, The quiet triumph of survival glowed brighter than any star in the sky. Life may push us into nights so dark we think the morning will never come. People may mock us, reject us, or even cast us aside, but destiny has a way of finding those who refuse to give up. Just like Dira, you must hold on to hope even when it feels like nobody sees you, because the same God who watched her in the shadows also sees you in yours. I pray for you today. May every rejection in your life turn into redirection toward your true purpose. May those who once looked down on you live to see you rise higher than they imagined. May God place helpers on your path, people who will lift you when the world turns its back. May your story end not in shame but in glory, not in bitterness but in joy. And may you never lack the strength to keep walking, even when the road is rough. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.